Hello. In the last video I told you about where HCI came from, and what I'm going to do now is tell you how that evolved into UX. So I've called this talk From HCI to UX. Now UX of course is user experience, and it's not quite the same thing as HCI, although it's often used to be almost synonymous. Really, user experience is a broader term. It's much more holistic than just HCI, which is just the human factors of computers. There is an international standard for user experience these days, ISO 9241210, which was published in 2008, was revised recently in 2019, and that is called the ergonomics of human sister interaction. And in that standard, it defines user experience as a person's perceptions and responses that result from the use or anticipated use of a product, system, or service. You see, that's a very broad definition, but user experience is a very broad topic. User experience really originates from the machine age, way before HCI or computers. Back in the heyday of the American industrialization, somebody called Frederick Winslow Taylor wrote a tremendously influential book called The Principles of Scientific Management in 1911. And this book was all about the interaction between labourers and their tools. And it was very influential, and it influenced, amongst many other people, this gentleman, who you may recognise as Henry Ford. And a lot of Henry Ford's innovations in manufacturing and invention of mass production to, make these things was very much based on Frederick Winslow's theories. Many years later, when HCI as a discipline was mature, these ideas started getting applied to it. And this brings us to the legendary Xerox PARC, Palo Alto Research Center, where a lot of that work was done in the 1970s. Xerox PARC built on the work of Douglas Engelbart in the 1960s, and they hired somebody called Bob Taylor, who was one of Doug Engelbart's collaborators, and they designed the modern GUI, the graphical user interface, the thing that you're all familiar with. It doesn't matter whether you use a Windows or a Mac or Linux. The design principles are all much the same, and they were all worked out in the 1970s in Xerox PARC. So much so that Ted Nelson has joked, saying that these things shouldn't be called GUIs at all. They should be called a PUI, a PARC user interface. There was, of course, from that time, the Prometheus myth of the IT industry, that Steve Jobs visited Xerox PARC in the late 1970s and stole from them all of the ideas for Apple computers and went on to design the Lisa and the Macintosh. It's a great story. Sadly, it's probably not true. Steve Jobs did actually visit Xerox PARC several times in the late 1970s, but the ideas of the GUI were fairly well known in the industry at that time, and there's evidence that Apple were already working on them when he went there. But it's a good story. By the 1980s, however, HCI was well established, very well established as a discipline in its own right, and it evolved into user experience in the 1990s, mostly as a result of work done in Apple in the user experience architect's office, and that was the first use of the phrase user experience. Now, at Apple, at that time, these user experience architects thought that the experience of using computers was poor. And this is the whole experience when someone first discovers a computer. So the experience starts in the shop when a person buys a computer. And then they find that it comes in a big heavy box that was hard to fit in the car. And they had to lug it home. And when they got it home, they found that the box was full of lots of scary cables and sockets that all needed to be plugged together in the right way. And all of that is user experience before the machine is even turned on. The user experience is everything that touches the interaction with the product. So this term was used to describe anything that enhances this process. Today, when the term user experience is used to refer to software design, it's often badly misused by just focusing about software in isolation. It should be about everything. It should be about the entirety of the experience. The way you experience the world, the way you experience your life, and the way you experience a service. And that can include an app or a website or a computer system, but they're just part of a much, much larger whole. Now, the head of this user experience architect's office back in the 1990s was a tremendously influential designer called Donald Norman. Long before he ever went to work for Apple, he published a classic book on design called originally it was called The Psychology of Everyday Things. This is my first edition from 1988. I think it's probably a collector's item now. It's still in print and it's been through many editions since. The last one was, I think, in 2013. And it's since been renamed The Design of Everyday Things because Donald Norman found that The Psychology of Everyday Things was too academic a title, and he really wanted this to be a practical handbook of design. And it's a fantastic read, and if you're interested in design and want to make a profession out of design, you really, really should read this book. It's an absolute classic. And Donald Norman was Apple's first user experience architect, and he coined the phrase user experience. So in many ways, he's called the father of user experience. Another person from Apple back in those days was Bruce Tognazini, Tog as he is known. And Bruce Tognazini wrote my favourite design book of all time. It's a fantastic book which is simply called Tog on Interface, another one that's been around for a long time but still in print. Bruce Tognazini was involved in the design of the original Apple Mac interface, and he worked as a designer for Apple for many, many years. And this wonderful book is really his thoughts and his reflections on designing computer interfaces, and there's lots of examples of how things are done in the Macintosh, but it's really a lot of fundamental principles of design. It's a great book and a very entertaining read. The last of these people, although not an Apple person, but he's associated with them frequently, is Jakob Nielsen. Jakob Nielsen too has written a very influential book called Designing Web Usability. It was written a long time ago, back in the 1990s, in the early days of the web, but a lot of the fundamental principles of this are still hold good today, and it's still a book in print, and it's still a classic. Now, the main reason I've mentioned these three people is that they have now established a company. It's called the Nielsen Normal Group, and it's a design consultancy company. And they run a lot of training, commercial training. They publish stuff that you can buy, and you can indeed hire them to come and consult on your designs or give talks. But they also give away a lot of their material for free. This website, if you can see it, nngroup.com. This is a fantastic website, the Nielsen Norman Group website. And for anybody interested in user experience, it is just full of valuable resources, articles by these people and many others, and also videos and training material, and there's a lot of free stuff there. So I strongly recommend that you head over to nngroup.com and listen to what these great designers have to say. Okay, so that really is where user experience came from. It's an academic discipline, it's an international standard, and it's fundamental to good system design, including good software design. So, thank you very much for listening.